Hello, I'm beginning this video by introducing a boy called Bristow Munn Wilcox. Bristow was born on the 29th of July 1902 in Grantham, Lincolnshire, which is in England. His family were British subjects, but at the time of his birth they'd not been in England for long. His father George was born in Hackney in London, and in the 1901 British census gave his occupation as a dealer in old clothes. His mother Sarah Ann came from Queensland, Australia, and she must have found Grantham a very cold, dark, dreary place to be raising children. They travelled around a bit. The oldest children were born in Australia, the middle two were born in New Zealand, and only the youngest two were British born. George Wilcox was born in Hackney, London, but Grantham, Lincolnshire was actually his home ground. That's where his parents lived. And I'm guessing that's why the family went back there, so the children could know their grandparents, and probably so the grandparents could help Sarah while the children were young. It may not have been easy for Sarah. However nice England can be on a warm sunny day, that's not the same thing at all as a sunny day in Queensland, Australia. In 1901 there were 6 children in the family. Alora and William were the eldest at ages 13 and 12. Myrtle and Letitia were 10 and 8, and the littlest were Millicent and Isabel, mere babies, in 1901. Just a year after this census, Millicent and Isabel were buried in the Grantham Cemetery, and in that same year, Bristow Munn Wilcox was born into the family. 1 year after his birth, the family left England and returned to Australia. The much-reduced Wilcox family settled in the picturesque state of Tasmania, and there they lived for the rest of their lives. Why was I at all interested? Because Bristow Munn Wilcox's mother gave him a book and wrote him a dedication on the inside cover. It was a conversation we had at work that led me to make this video. Someone said that writing inside books devalues them, and I've heard that before, but I find it very hard to believe. I will buy a book specifically because there's something written inside it. So I went to the internet to see what the experts said. And what I found was that this is a rather intense debate among people in the book world. On one side you have booksellers who say that it does devalue the books, and on the other you have antiquarian booksellers who say that it depends. The divide isn't equally down each camp either. There are some antiquarian booksellers who say that a book is devalued by anything other than writing inside the cover that came from the author themselves, and others feel that it adds to provenance of the work and it doesn't matter who wrote it, it's part of the book's story and therefore has some value. There's less diversity of opinion among sellers of newer books. Across the board they seem to agree that a book is worth less if it has anything written inside it other than the author's own mark. But apparently this hasn't always been the case, and some book collectors out there are saying that the trend is changing back the other way and that it's starting to be acceptable to mark your books again. There's obviously no right or wrong answer here. A blog writer for the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America was absolutely appalled at advice he'd found to remove end papers if they had writing on them or to try to scrub out the details. In the antiquarian book world that's considered vandalism and should never be done. Obviously you're talking about different things when you talk about new books and old books, especially these days where there are a lot of mass-produced books. On the surface you'd think this was apples and oranges, that the way a book was made 150 years ago was so different to the way they're done today that the rules for one sort of book can't possibly apply to the other. But that's actually not true. We certainly do bigger print runs these days. We've got the capacity to produce books in the hundreds of thousands, but actually most books aren't produced in that sort of volume. And all of those books from 150 years ago were once new books, were once considered to be just as disposable as we consider our new books today. So I think it comes down to what do you have a book for? Because one change certainly is that people tended to hang on to their books for longer 150 years ago than we do now. I saw one blog article when I was researching this that was saying a book makes an excellent present, because it doesn't matter if somebody gets 5 copies of it, they can just keep one of them and take the other 4 back to the shop. And that is one reason why you shouldn't write a gift dedication inside a book. I find that incomprehensible, because to me, if somebody has given me something, it's not really the object itself that matters, it's the information that they chose to give me that thing. So I personally would end up having to keep all 5 books if I was given 5 copies of a book. I would, of course, value the book that I was given, but the giving is the point to me. I couldn't possibly take back a book that somebody had given me, even if I had several copies of it. I've been lucky, that hasn't happened very much to me. So having got all that out of the way, that really it comes down to what you've got the book for and whether you're expecting to keep it, I then dived into this whole world of inscriptions and dedications and the vocabulary used for them. There are specific names for specific types of scribbles inside books, which I never knew, and different ones are valued differently. So that's what I'm going to go through now. And I had to take notes for this one because my brain isn't holding all the things. So, types of inscriptions. We have author signatures. That is where an author has opened that copy of the book and signed his own name in it. Now, even there, we have 2 types. We have dedications, which is when the author has come along and said, "To John, all the best," and signed his name. So effectively, the author is leaving a personal note in the book to the book owner. The other type of author signature is where the author has simply signed the book, no dedication, nothing personal. You open the book and you just find the name of the author scrawled in there in pen, because he has done it by hand. This is what you commonly get, apparently, at a book signing. I've actually never gone to a book signing. I do have books that have been personally signed by the authors, but what I have is dedications. They dedicated it to me because I just requested that. I bought a copy of their book and I asked them if they could put something in it. Now, there seems to be a huge debate about which of those 2 is the most valuable. If it's your favourite author and you've bought the book, it's going to be hugely valuable whichever it is. Just the fact that they wrote that in this book, you're really into that author, and this is a connection with that author. That's all you need. But for people who buy and sell books, and apparently for people who get a book signed specifically because they think it might increase in value that way, and not because they bought the book for itself, there's another debate over which you really want in a book. Do you want the personal dedication? Do you want just the signature, which is occasionally referred to as flat signed? Through the 1970s and 1980s, flat signed was deemed to be the best thing. If you put a dedication in it, it labels that book as pre-owned because it was dedicated to someone. The author has written it to somebody who clearly owned the book, purchased the book, and the author is corresponding directly with the book owner through that dedication. Whereas if it's flat signed, it might be absolutely brand new, never touched by anybody else's hands. Through the 70s and 80s, that was the most valuable thing. And this apparently has changed because of the internet, because it's become quite easy for people to obtain signatures and forge them in books. So there's actually a market out there for scammers selling signed copies of books that aren't genuine. Because of this, the trend is moving back to the dedication as the most valuable, since the dedication is less easy to forge and you can generally obtain the provenance. You can find out who that person was. You can learn whether they really did know the author. It's verifiable. And a side note here on vocabulary, an author will sign a printed copy of his book. He does not autograph it. It's only called an autograph if you have the original handwritten manuscript and the author has put his signature to that. So when we're looking at books, we're looking at flat signed or dedicated. Moving on. Still on the author signatures, we've got something called a facsimile signature, which is where the author has signed it and that signature has been placed in the print run, it's printed with the book, so it comes through at the start of the book as if the author has signed it individually, but they haven't. I have an example of this. I have an edition of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, and in the front of this we have Charles Dickens' picture and his signature. So that is a facsimile signature. Next we have association signatures. This is effectively a dedication, but it's a dedication of an author to another person of fame. So the value of that signature may not be the author, but the person they're giving it to. I find that a rather grey area because I feel like things will move into that category and then move out of them maybe. And author might dedicate a book to somebody who is just their next door neighbour, and 50 years later that person goes on to become famous, and everybody who had those early editions might have just tossed them out, hearing the advice that it's worthless if it's got a dedication in it, and now they're all kicking themselves. I can see that happening. That probably has happened. And it can go the other way. You can buy a book because of its association signature where the person who was famous is now not famous at all. I see that a lot with the 19th century things I've got. People have forwards in their book written by somebody who was a big name at the time, like a society reverend. Some of the reverends in the cathedrals in England had pretty much pop star status, and if they wrote the introduction page of a book, then people would buy it because they'd recommended it. But to us today, that's meaningless. We've never heard of this person. I guess all of that is part of the fun of collecting. So now I'm going to move on to owner inscriptions, which is actually what I'm more interested in. I do have a few books in my collection that are signed by the author, but while that's cool, I love to know who used to own a book that I now own. And I was really pleased to see several blogs by the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America talking about the value in that. There's a few things I like about it. For me, this is because I like to know who used to own the book I now own. It's really interesting to see where a book has been, how it's travelled across the world, how it's gone from one place to another. I find all that fascinating. But I'm not an antiquarian. I am just somebody who collects books, and I love obscure books, and I love that books have had their own personal lives before they've come to me. I feel like I'm the current custodian of a book that has already existed longer than I will live and is going to go on existing way, way longer. And I quite like to know who the people are who used to own it, to see if I have anything in common with them. And that touches on the matter of provenance. Now, provenance is simply the story of an object, the verifiable story of an object. Provenance allows us to ascertain that the object really is as old as it's supposed to be, that it really is what it looks to be. And for a museum, this is absolutely crucial. For an antiquarian book dealer, this is very important. So many older books don't come with a year of publication. You can't really just look at a book and determine its age, because a newish book might have had a very hard life, an oldish book might have been looked after beautifully, and facsimile editions have been published all through time. So you can get leather-bound books that look as if they're very, very old and aren't. I don't think anybody argues the importance of provenance these days. That said, that blog post I read did say they'd found recent advice on the internet by supposed experts, that was the phrase he used, supposed experts, that were telling people to remove their end papers and scrub out the writing in the front of books, and that is bad advice. There is no circumstance in which that will be the correct thing to do. I found an article in The Guardian that was talking about ownership, dedications and inscriptions being a matter of ego. Maybe in the modern world you can make a case for that. I don't think that held. It really was a form of communication to somebody. They were going to hang on to a book forever, and in 50 years' time you could open that book and you could remember the giving. You could remember that moment of giving, it like a greeting card. I don't think ego really came into it. Maybe in the modern world it does. Maybe if today I buy a book that I'm going to give to a friend and I write something to them in the front, maybe that's ego. It wouldn't be for me. For me it would simply be because I want that writing to be there in 150 years so that somebody can ascertain the age of that book that I have just bought brand new. They can see where it's been. The Guardian came out with several examples of people that had written sort of inappropriate things in books that they would then be embarrassed to find out in public. That to me isn't properly the matter of inscriptions. That's a different matter. That's the same as when you post something online that you shouldn't have. You're effectively doing the same thing. If you write something in the front of a book, it's out there for the world to see. It's a smaller audience, sure, but it's still there permanently, and you don't know how many people through the next 100 years or so are going to see it. And even in the shorter term, if you write something that's a bit cringy or deeply personal in a book that you're giving to somebody and it's on their shelf, then anyone who visits them might pick that book up out of the shelf to read it and see that written there. So you do need to have some common sense about these things, but that's not an argument to not do it. The other point related to this is, of course, that somebody might learn something about you later on, the way I did about Bristow Munn Wilcox. And that's true, but you can't do what I did for him for anybody recent. I used records that are out in the public domain. Shipping records for over 100 years ago are open slather. Anybody can view them because all the people who are listed are now deceased. Same for the 1901 census. If Bristow Munn Wilson had been born in 1950 and his mother gave him that book in 1960, for instance, I wouldn't have had any chance of finding him. It's only because of his age. So somebody who writes something like that in a book today, it's going to be the book owner in 2121 who can do that research and find that person. That said, it's actually very hard to do what I did for Bristow Munn Wilcox. I could only do that because he had a very unusual name. I have other books for whom I would love to be able to track the owners, but it can't be done. There's just nothing distinguishing enough in what is written. One example of this is my 1863 Good Words that I did a video on 2 weeks ago. The inscription in the beginning of that is to Mary Ann Turner from her brother. There's a fair bit of detail there, but their names are just not uncommon enough for me to find. We can presume, I think, that the date given is Mary Ann Turner's birth date, so we even have her birthday, but because we don't have a year, most record repositories require you to search by year, and she could be any age. George could be giving her this book on her 90th birthday. There's just no way of knowing. And there's no way of knowing what country she came from. I would love to find those people, though. And George's handwriting is so beautiful. I would like to know who was George Turner, who was so nice to his sister and writes like that. So what I'm going to do now is just show off a couple of the little books that I have where people have written in the beginnings. I have, for instance, The Swiss Family Robinson, this is a beautiful volume, this one. It's very heavy. It's a very heavy board book. But in the front of this, there's a lovely dedication to dear little Johnny on his 9th birthday from his loving father and mother. I'll pop this on the screen. I also have Little Lord Fauntleroy. It's another quite heavy board book. This inscription, I actually can't read it. It's to dear little something from Auntie, April 18th, 1896. There's not enough there for me to work out. And that's really all I wanted to say about this. This was a little bit rambly. I think my main point is that I hope the practice continues. I hope people do put dedications inside books with a view to that dedication being read perhaps by strangers in the future, but knowing that it's a little piece of the modern world that is then going to carry on into the future world, because at the moment the fashion of not putting any mark in your book whatsoever is going to lead to a real dearth of information about readership and ownership of books from this century when it is researched in the future. I'll leave it there because this video is already late. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you for watching.